My daughter told me she wished I was dead, not in a fight, not in the middle of some heated argument where words fly fast and nobody means what they say. She said it calmly, over the sound of a coffee maker she didn't pay for in a house I helped buy on my birthday. She looked me right in the eyes and she told me her life would be easier if I just disappeared. The worst part, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I picked up my purse, walked to my car, and sat there for 40 minutes staring at the dashboard while something enormous rearranged itself inside my chest. Not breaking, just rearranging, because some deep, exhausted, finally honest part of me had been waiting for her to say it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it started, to 5 o'clock in the morning on October 14th in a one-bedroom apartment on Birch Street where a 67-year-old retired nurse stood in her kitchen and frosted a strawberry cake she had no intention of eating herself. My name is Margaret Shaw, Maggie to the people who know me well, which is a shorter list than you might expect for a woman who spent 31 years showing up for strangers in the worst moments of their lives. I work night shifts, holiday shifts, double shifts, the shifts nobody else wanted. I held the hands of people who were dying because their own families couldn't be bothered to drive across town. I was good at my job because I understood in a way that went bone deep that being present for someone is the most important thing one human being can do for another. I understood that. I just never figured out how to apply it to myself. The cake was strawberry with cream cheese frosting, my daughter Claire's favorite. My favorite is lemon. Nobody has asked me that in years, but there it is for the record. Lemon. I made strawberry because that's what I did. That's who I had always been. Margaret Shaw, the woman who shows up, the woman who gives, the woman who makes the other person's favorite, even when it's her own birthday. I put on my good blouse, the navy one with the small pearl buttons I found at a consignment shop 2 years ago because I couldn't justify spending full price on myself, even though the week before I had written a check for $9,000 to cover Claire's kitchen renovation. I did my hair. I put on lipstick. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and thought, you look like someone's grandmother, which I was. 2 grandchildren, Oliver, who was 9, and Sophie, who was 6. The only 2 people in that entire family who ever looked genuinely happy to see me walk through a door. I drove 35 minutes to the house on Wexford Lane, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a yard with a fence that Claire's husband Derek had never gotten around to staining. I knew every inch of that house. I should. I had put the down payment on it, $42,000, my retirement savings handed over in a cashier's check, while Derek stood in the kitchen with a beer and said nothing. Not thank you, not we'll pay you back, just silence and a Budweiser and that particular look he had perfected over the years like I was furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. Derek's truck was gone when I pulled into the driveway, which was fine. I preferred it when Derek wasn't around. I grabbed the cake from the passenger seat. I'd also brought groceries because the last time I visited their refrigerator had 3 condiment bottles and a gallon of expired milk, and my grandchildren deserved to eat real food, eggs, bread, fruit, the good sharp cheddar Oliver liked, a bag of those small tangerines Sophie had recently decided she could peel herself, which she was enormously proud of. The front door was unlocked as always. I had told Claire 100 times to lock her door. She had a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old in that house. She would roll her eyes whenever I said it, that slow dismissive roll that meant I had become background noise, something she could hear without listening. I stepped inside. The house smelled like stale coffee and one of those vanilla candles from Home Goods. The living room was a mess in the specific way that meant nobody had cleaned in days. Toys scattered across the floor, a cereal bowl balanced on a couch cushion, a pile of unopened mail on the dining table that looked like it hadn't been touched in weeks. I called out. Claire answered from the back of the house from the sunroom. That was the room she'd had added 2 years ago, the one I gave $6,000 toward because Derek said they couldn't cover the contractor's full bid, and Claire called me crying saying the kids needed a play space. What was I supposed to do? I had never said no to my daughter, not once in 34 years. That word simply didn't exist in my vocabulary when it came to her. She was sitting in a wicker chair in a silk robe at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. Her hair was in one of those carefully constructed, messy buns. She had her phone in her hand and she looked up at me the way you look at a delivery driver who showed up while you're trying to enjoy your lunch break. I smiled. I always smiled. I told her I'd brought cake. I held up the bag of groceries and mentioned her fridge had looked a little sad last time. She sighed. If you have ever had someone sigh at you in a way that communicates not fatigue, but pure casual dismissal, you know exactly the sound I'm describing. It's the sound of a person who has decided your existence is mildly inconvenient. She told me she'd been busy. She and Derek were dealing with some financial stuff. I asked what kind of financial stuff, and she shifted in her chair. The mortgage, she said. 2 months behind. My stomach dropped. 2 months behind. I had given them $8,000 in April, specifically for the mortgage. $8,000 I had pulled from my long-term savings, the account that was supposed to carry me through my 70s and 80s when my body finally gave out from 3 decades of 12-hour shifts on hard hospital floors. I had transferred that money because Claire called on a Tuesday night, voice shaking, saying she didn't know what they were going to do. And I had said, as I always said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll take care of it." I asked her what had happened to the April money. She shifted again. Things came up, she said. Derek's truck needed repairs, Sophie's dance classes, credit card bills. Her voice took on that clipped, defensive tone I had learned to recognize over decades, a rubber band pulled too tight. I told her I had given her that money specifically for the mortgage, and she had told me it was going to the mortgage, and now she was sitting here telling me the mortgage was 2 months behind. So where had the $8,000 gone? She snapped. She told me I didn't get to hand her money and then audit how she spent it. That wasn't how gifts worked. I told her it wasn't a gift. She had said it was a loan. She said it felt like a gift at the time. I stared at my daughter. This woman I had raised alone after her father walked out when she was 3. This person I had worked double shifts for so she could have braces and ballet lessons and a college education. This person I had given my body and my savings and my sleep and my solitude to for 34 years, and I felt something happen inside me, not breaking, a crack, like a windshield hit by a piece of gravel on the highway. The damage is there, you can see it spreading, but the glass holds. For now, I said quietly that maybe we could figure something out. Work through it. Claire told me there was nothing to figure out. She said she and Derek needed space. Grant said I was too involved. Derek, I thought. Derek, who hadn't held a steady job in 3 years. Derek, who, according to the most recent conversation I could remember, had spent $200 on a fantasy football account in the same month their mortgage went unpaid. That Derek had opinions about my level of involvement in keeping a roof over my grandchildren's heads. I said something I probably shouldn't have said. I said maybe the reason she felt like she couldn't do anything without me was because she couldn't. The words landed. I watched them hit. Claire's face went white, then red, jaw tightening, the muscles working under her skin. She told me to get out. I reminded her it was my birthday, and that's when she said it. She didn't yell. She didn't throw it at me like a weapon. She said it the way you'd comment on the weather or mention what time it was, flat and calm and almost bored. She said that sometimes she thought her life would just be easier if I wasn't around anymore, if I was just gone. No more showing up uninvited, no more keeping score of every dollar, no more guilt, just gone. The room went quiet in that specific way it does after something irreversible has been said. Not peaceful quiet, ringing quiet, the kind you get after an explosion when the air itself seems stunned. I looked at my daughter. She looked back at me. There was no apology in her eyes, none. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. I tried again. My lips moved, but my voice had packed up and left for somewhere safer, somewhere it wouldn't be used to beg for basic human acknowledgement from someone who had just told me to stop existing. I walked out, through the living room, past the strawberry cake on the counter, her favorite that I had been awake since 5 to make, past the bag of groceries with the good cheddar and the tangerines, out the front door which I didn't close behind me. She could lock it herself for once. I got to my car, sat down, put my hands on the steering wheel. For 40 minutes I didn't move, didn't cry, didn't call anyone, just sat there with the engine off and the windows up while something enormous rearranged itself inside my chest. Here is the part that broke me more than the words themselves. I wasn't shocked. Some deep, exhausted, finally honest part of me that I had been smothering for decades had known this was where we were heading, had known that you cannot pour yourself into another person for 34 years without eventually becoming invisible to them, without becoming wallpaper, without becoming the thing they lean on so hard they forget there's a living person underneath the weight. I drove home. I set my purse on the kitchen table next to the half-empty tube of frosting and the mixing bowl I hadn't washed yet. The apartment was quiet as it always was. I had lived alone since Claire left for college 16 years ago. In all that time, the loudest sound in my life had been my phone ringing when my daughter needed something. I sat on the edge of my bed and I looked at my hands. 67-year-old hands, nurses' hands, rough and capable and marked in small ways from decades of IV lines and surgical tape and late-night emergencies in fluorescent-lit hallways. These hands had held Claire the moment she was born, had wiped her tears, signed her permission slips, written her tuition checks. These hands had never not once reached for anything for themselves first. I had an appointment that afternoon, one I'd scheduled 6 months earlier, not because I was in crisis, but because there had been a night in April when my grandson Oliver had asked me why his mom always seemed sad, and the question had kept me awake until morning in a way I couldn't quite explain. Dr. Karen Meeks, licensed clinical psychologist, third floor of a medical building near the university, beige walls, chairs angled slightly toward each other, a tissue box that was always full, which I had always considered a professional courtesy. I drove there still wearing the navy blouse with the pearl buttons. I sat down in the angled chair, and Dr. Meeks looked at me and asked what had brought me in today. I told her, all of it, the cake, the groceries, the missing $8,000, the silk robe, the sigh, and the sentence, the flat, almost bored sentence that had split my day in half. Dr. Meeks listened the way she always did, without interrupting, without reacting visibly, without leaning forward at the dramatic parts to signal that yes, this is the moment where we should both feel something. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked what I had felt when Claire said it. I told her the truth, though it cost me something to say it out loud. I told her I had felt relieved, a horrible, involuntary, unmistakable wave of relief, and that the relief had hurt more than the words themselves. Dr. Meeks nodded slowly. She asked me to stay with that for a second. Then she said something that I have thought about every day since. She said that the relief meant some part of me had already known, had known for a long time, and she asked if I had already known, and I had kept going anyway. What did I think had been keeping me there? I didn't have an answer. In 34 years of being Claire's mother, in 31 years of nursing, in 67 years of being Margaret Shaw, I had always had an answer, an action to take, a check to write, a problem to absorb. For the first time, I could remember I had nothing, and in the silence of that beige room with the never-empty tissue box, I understood that the absence of an answer was itself the most important thing I had felt all day. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table, and I did something I had been meaning not to do for years, which was open the box of files I kept in the hall closet and start counting. Not counting emotions, not counting grievances, counting money, actual numbers on actual paper going back to the beginning. Tax returns, bank statements, canceled checks, receipts, emails confirming wire transfers, the entire paper record of 14 years. I started with the easy ones. The down payment on the Wexford Lane house, $42,000. I remembered writing that check because my hand had actually trembled. Claire was 28, just married, and they couldn't get approved for the full mortgage without a larger down payment. She had called on a Tuesday night, voice already breaking before I answered, telling me they were going to lose the house. There was another offer. They needed the down payment by Friday. She had said she wanted her kids to grow up in a real house with a yard, the way she had. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom rental with water stains on the ceiling. But sure, I thought then and still think now, like she had. I transferred the money the next day. Then the wedding, $23,000 for the venue, the catering, the dress, the flowers, a photographer who charged more per hour than I had made in a full shift at the hospital. Derek's family contributed nothing. His mother mailed a card with a $50 bill inside and a note that said, "Wishing you love and happiness." I still have that card. I have kept it in the back of a drawer, as evidence of something, though I am not entirely sure what. Imbalance, maybe. The particular kind of quiet injustice that happens in families every day and nobody names out loud. Then the smaller things, which were never actually small, they only felt small because they came one at a time. Claire's car breaking down, $3,000. Derek losing his job, $5,000 to cover bills while he figured things out. Sophie's birth and the insurance gap, $4,000 for hospital bills. Oliver's tutoring, $200 a month for 18 months. The roof leaking, $7,000. The kitchen renovation, $6,000. And then the credit card debt in waves, $8,000. Then another $5,000. Then another $3,000, each one arriving via the same late-night phone call, the same soft, shaking voice, the same words, "Mom, I don't know what we're going to do." And every time the same answer from me, "Don't worry, sweetheart, I'll take care of it." 4 words that I had said so many times they had stopped meaning anything except Margaret Shaw exists to absorb this. By noon, I had a number, rough around the edges because some of the older records were incomplete, because I had slipped cash into Claire's purse more times than I could count, because there were things I had paid for in the moment and never written down, because it had never occurred to me that documentation would one day matter, but close enough to make me push my chair back from the table and stare at the wall. $463,000. That was what I had given Claire and Derek over 14 years, not counting groceries, not counting gas money, not counting my time, my sleep, my health, my canceled plans, my missed opportunities, every vacation I hadn't taken, everything I hadn't bought for myself, the entire architecture of my life, bent around the needs of a woman who had just told me to stop existing. $463,000 from a retired nurse living in a one-bedroom apartment with a leaky faucet she hadn't called the landlord about because she'd been too busy worrying about her daughter's mortgage. I closed the laptop. I looked at the mixing bowl in the sink, the one I'd used to make the strawberry cake at 5 in the morning, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt something I didn't immediately recognize. Hot, hard, sitting in the center of my chest like a coal that had just caught. Not sadness, not guilt, not that soft, apologetic, maybe I deserved it feeling I had been carrying for years like a second purse. This was something else entirely. This was anger, real anger, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't scream, the kind that sits down, opens a file, and starts making plans. I picked up my phone. I did not call Claire. For the first time in 34 years, when something seismic happened in my life, I did not reach for my daughter. I called a lawyer. His name was Victor Hale. I found him through an online search. Family attorney, downtown office, strong reviews, reasonable rates. His receptionist put me through, and when Victor answered, his voice was steady in a way I found immediately useful. Not warm, steady, like a railing on a staircase in the dark. You reach for it and it holds, which is all you need. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was more than I could say for most people in my life. And when I finished, he asked me one question. He asked if I knew whose names were on the deed to the Wexford Lane property. I said I assumed Claire and Derek. It was their house. I had just provided the down payment. Victor told me we needed to find out, because if my name was on that title even partially, I had legal standing, that changed everything about my situation. He used the phrase legal standing the way a doctor uses a diagnosis: precise, serious, caring weight. I told him I'd never thought of myself as having legal standing. I was a mother. Mothers had guilt and obligation and a phone that rang at midnight when someone else's life was falling apart. Legal standing was for other people. Victor Hale did not particularly care how I had thought of myself. He cared about what the paperwork said. I hung up, sat in my kitchen with cold coffee and a mixing bowl in the sink, and October trees dropping leaves outside my window, letting go of what they couldn't carry into winter. That afternoon, I did something small that felt enormous. I logged into my bank account and opened the joint emergency fund I had set up years ago, the one I had created specifically for Claire, funded entirely from my own overtime shifts and holiday bonuses and the unglamorous necessary work of being the nurse on the floor nobody else wanted to work. $11,000, every cent mine. I closed the account, transferred the balance to my personal savings, removed Claire's access entirely. Then I sat very still and waited for the guilt to arrive, because it always arrived when I did anything for myself. That familiar wave of shame, the voice that sounded like my own mother asking what kind of woman takes from her child. The guilt came, of course it did, but underneath it, for the first time, there was something else, something I had not felt in so long I almost didn't recognize it. Relief. I looked around my apartment, the small rooms, the second-hand furniture, a framed photograph on the bookshelf of Claire at age 7, gap-toothed and laughing, holding a dandelion she'd picked for me in the backyard of our old rental. That little girl, all bright eyes and cold feet, pressed against my legs during thunderstorms, whispering that I shouldn't let the sky fall. I didn't know where that girl had gone. Maybe she grew up. Maybe she married the wrong man. Maybe I held on too tight and she could only break free the one way she knew how, by breaking me first. I didn't know. What I knew was that the woman in the silk robe was not that girl anymore, and I could not keep setting myself on fire to keep her warm. I washed the mixing bowl, dried it, put it away. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and I wrote 2 words at the top of the first page: my terms. I stared at those 2 words for a long time. In 67 years, I had never written them. I had always had conditions, certainly, but they were conditions other people set for my love and my time and my money and my presence. Terms of my own rules. I expected others to follow boundaries with actual consequences. Never. Not once. Not in all my years of nursing or mothering or living alone in this small apartment, pretending that giving everything away had made me full. I picked up the pen. I wrote for 2 hours, 3 pages of things I should have said years ago, decades ago, before the first check was written, before the first manufactured crisis, before the first time I said, "Don't worry, sweetheart," and meant it as a replacement for every hard conversation we never had. When I finished, I folded the pages, slid them into a plain envelope, and wrote 2 words on the front: for me. I put the envelope in my nightstand drawer next to my reading glasses and a bottle of ibuprofen and a photograph of myself at 30, young and exhausted, holding a baby who would grow up to wish me gone. October 14th, the day I turned 67, the day my daughter told me to disappear, and the day Margaret Shaw, for the first time in her life, sat down, and decided she was allowed to have terms. 3 days went by before Claire noticed the account was closed. Not 2 days, not one, 3 full days, 72 hours before my daughter discovered that $11,000 had vanished from her reach. That single fact told me more about how she valued what I gave her than anything she had ever said to my face. It was furniture to her, background infrastructure, the kind of thing you don't notice until it stops working, like heat in January or water from a tap. You don't appreciate it, you just expect it to be there. I spent those 3 days at my kitchen table doing something I should have done years ago, not cleaning, not worrying, organizing. My entire financial history with Claire and Derek, going back to the day she turned 18, and I started writing checks I couldn't really afford for a girl who was never asked to understand what they cost. I built a chronological record in a 3-ring binder, every entry labeled and dated, every transfer cross-referenced with a bank statement. By the end of the second day, I had something that looked less like a mother's generosity and more like a portfolio. Evidence, the kind of thing you bring to a meeting. On Thursday evening, I was sitting on my couch, eating leftover lentil soup, when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Her name. I want to tell you what happened in that moment, because it surprised me more than anything else that week. My hand did not reach for the phone immediately. I sat there and I looked at her name glowing on the screen, and I felt something I had never felt before in 34 years of being her mother. I hesitated, not because I didn't love her, because answering had always been a reflex automatic as breathing, and for the first time I was aware of the reflex itself, watching it from a slight distance, choosing whether or not to follow it. I picked up on the 5th ring. She didn't say hello. She said, "Mom," one syllable, the way you say a word when you've already decided it's a summons rather than a greeting. I said, "Hello, Claire." She asked what had happened to the account. I told her I had closed it. She said I couldn't do that. I told her I could because it was my money, every dollar of it. My name was the primary account holder, and I had closed my own account. She said that account was for emergencies. I told her it had been her emergency fund for 6 years, funded entirely by me, and I had never once withdrawn from it. She said she needed that money. The mortgage was 2 months behind. I told her I knew. She had mentioned it on my birthday, right before she told me her life would be easier without me in it. There was a short, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, then silence. I could hear the particular quality of it, the half-second recalibration, and I realized I could read the silence clearly now in a way I hadn't before. I had been watching this pattern for 34 years without naming it. She was choosing her next move, tears or righteous anger or cold withdrawal. She had a full repertoire, and I had fallen for every entry in it at least a dozen times. She chose anger. She told me she had never said anything like that. I was twisting her words. I quoted her back to herself, the exact phrasing, the exact tone. She said that wasn't what she meant. I said I had been there and I remembered what she meant. She said I showed up uninvited and interrogated her about money and made her feel like she couldn't function without me. I said you could say thank you. Just once, Claire. In 34 years, once. She went quiet in a different way then, not calculating, just quiet. I could hear the house around her, the particular creak of floors I had paid for, and somewhere in the background, the low sound of a television. The silence had weight to it. She told me she needed that money back. I told her no. She called me selfish. I almost laughed. I held it back, but just barely. The woman who had written $463,000 in checks over 14 years was being called selfish because she had closed her own savings account. If someone had written that scene in a novel, I would have said the author was reaching for easy irony. But Claire wasn't performing. She genuinely believed it, because I had spent 3 decades teaching her to believe it. Every time I said yes when I should have said no, every time I absorbed a consequence so she wouldn't have to feel it, I had been writing the same lesson into her in permanent ink. Margaret Shaw exists to give. Wanting anything back is selfishness. Stopping is betrayal. I told her good night. I hung up. Then I sat in my quiet apartment with the soup cooling in the bowl and my heart going too fast, and I waited. Not for guilt, not this time. I sat with my hands flat on the kitchen table, and I waited to find out what I was made of. The next morning I went to see Victor Hale. His office was on the 6th floor of a building downtown, the kind of building that smells permanently of old carpet and recycled air. His receptionist Maria had kind eyes and a brass nameplate on her desk. She led me to a conference room with a long table and no windows, and Victor was already there, jacket on notepad open. I set the binder on the table. It landed with a solid final sound. Victor looked at it, then at me with the same expression he probably used for everything measured and unhurried. He said, "Walk me through it." So I did. I walked him through every line: the down payment, the wedding, the car repairs, the medical bills, the tutoring, the roof, the renovation, the credit card cycles that repeated themselves every 18 months like a fever that never fully broke. I walked him through the April transfer, the $8,000 that was supposed to catch up the mortgage and instead vanished into Derek's truck repairs and Sophie's dance fees. Victor took notes in a small, precise handwriting, not rushing me, not interrupting. When I finished, he set his pen down and looked at the binder for a long moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said that from a legal standpoint, many of these transfers would almost certainly be characterized by opposing counsel as parental gifts, that without loan agreements, without promissory notes, without any formal documentation acknowledging the expectation of repayment, the legal argument for recovery would be difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. I felt the floor shift slightly under my feet. I said there were no loan agreements because she was my daughter. You don't hand your daughter a contract when you're trying to help her stay housed. You trust her. Victor said he understood that. He also said that trust in the eyes of a court reads as gift, and that the word gift had consequences. I sat across from this man I had found on the internet 3 weeks ago, who had become in that short time one of the only people treating me like someone with rights rather than obligations, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the day I counted the money. Not anger, closer to despair, the particular despair of discovering that the system designed to protect people had no specific interest in protecting someone who had been too trusting to protect herself. Then Victor picked up his pen again and said, "However, before we discuss any of that, I want to share what I found when I pulled the title records on the Wexford Lane property. He let that sentence sit in the room for exactly 1 second. He said, "My name was on the deed." I heard the words. I processed them individually. My name was on the deed. I said that wasn't possible. I said I had just given Claire the money. It was their house. I hadn't been part of any ownership arrangement. I hadn't signed anything that said I was an owner. Victor explained that when the property was purchased, someone at the title company had added my name to the deed because I was the source of the down payment. It was not uncommon. The mortgage, the loan itself, was in Claire and Derek's names, but the deed, the actual legal document establishing who owned the property, listed me as a co-owner, Margaret Marie Shaw. My full name in black ink on the title to a house I had been told to leave. I owned part of it. The house where my daughter sat in a silk robe and wished me gone. The house I had written a $42,000 check for while Derek drank a beer and said nothing. I was a co-owner. Victor waited while I processed this. Then he said there was one more thing. He said that approximately 18 months ago, Claire and Derek had taken out a second mortgage against the property. $65,000. He paused. Without notifying me, without my signature, without my knowledge or consent on a property where my name appeared on the deed. I looked at him across the long conference table in the windowless room, and I heard the hum of the building's ventilation system, and I thought about Derek on the phone telling me I was too involved in his family's affairs. Too involved. That was the exact phrase he used. Too involved, while he was borrowing $65,000 against my property without telling me. Victor gave me a moment. Then he told me clearly what this meant. As a titled co-owner, I had legal rights to the property. I could request a formal buyout. I could petition the court for a partition sale, which would force the property to be sold and proceeds distributed among the owners after outstanding debts were settled. The second mortgage taken without my consent was a matter he intended to address separately because the way it had been obtained was, in his words, a serious problem. I thought of all the times Derek had looked at me over the top of his phone, all the years of being furniture in his house, an inconvenience, an ATM that occasionally had opinions. I thought of his voice on the phone saying, "Eleanor, not Mom, never Mom," telling me I was too close to his family's business. Victor laid out 3 options. He was organized in a way that I found genuinely comforting because after 34 years of chaos, management clarity felt like oxygen. The first option was to do nothing, leave my name on the title, and hope Claire and Derek eventually caught up. He said he didn't recommend it, and his tone made clear why. They were not catching up. They were falling further behind. The second option was to formally demand a buyout, sending a legal letter giving them 60 days to purchase my share at fair market value. The third, if they couldn't produce the money, which both of us understood they couldn't, was to petition the court for a partition sale. I asked what happened to the children if we forced a sale. Victor set down his pen. He looked at me the way he sometimes did when he had something important to say and wanted to make sure I was actually hearing it. He said, "Margaret, I want you to understand something clearly. You are not the person who put this family in danger. You are the person who kept them solvent for 14 years. The second mortgage, the missed payments, the mismanaged funds, those are their choices." He paused. You didn't cause this, you delayed it. Those 3 words, I delayed it, not prevented, not solved, delayed. For 14 years, I had been throwing money at a house that was sinking and telling myself I was building something solid. I hadn't been building anything, I had been buying time. Time for Claire to grow up, time for Derek to find his footing, time for someone in that household to learn how to stand without me holding them vertical. Nobody had learned. Nobody had needed to. I was always there. I told Victor to send the letter. Option 2, first 60 days, give them the chance to buy me out. And if they couldn't, we would file. My voice was level when I said it. My hands were still on the table. Something happened inside me in that moment. Not a crack this time. Something older and tighter. Something I had been holding close for decades loosened its grip just slightly, like a fist beginning very slowly to open. The letter went out on a Monday, certified mail return receipt. On Wednesday at 4:17 in the afternoon, my phone produced 12 text messages in 8 minutes. I read them all, every one. I sat at my kitchen table with my hands flat, on the surface the same position I had taken after hanging up on Claire, and I read them in order. What is this? You can't be serious. You're suing your own daughter. Derek is losing his mind. You're gonna take the house. Think about the kid's mom. Everyone is going to find out what you did. I'm calling Sandra. You are dead to me. Do not contact me or my children. I felt each one. I won't pretend otherwise. She knew exactly where to aim, and she had been aiming at those same targets for 34 years. The children, the family's reputation, the threat of complete severance. Every weapon she had ever deployed, she deployed now all at once. But here is what was different this time. I could see them as weapons. I could see the mechanics of it, the way each message was engineered to produce a specific response in a specific person, namely me, the person who had spent her entire adult life believing that good mothers absorb everything and apologize for the trouble. The weapons only work if the target still believes she deserves to be hit. I put the phone face down on the table. I washed the dishes from dinner. I dried them and put them away. Then I called Victor and told him she had received the letter. He told me his office had already received 3 voicemails, 1 from Claire and 2 from Derek. He said Derek had initially threatened to sue him personally, which was not how any of this worked, and had then called back to ask if there was any way to settle this quietly. Victor said that depends on whether they can produce the money. We both know they can't. Derek called me himself 3 weeks after the letter. In 14 years, he had called me twice, once to ask me to babysit, once to borrow $3,000 for what he described as a business opportunity, which turned out to be an online poker account. Both times I had said yes. Both times he had treated the conversation as a transaction and moved on. This time his voice was different. Still not warm, still not the voice of a man speaking to someone he considered family, but tight in a new way. He told me Claire hadn't been sleeping, hadn't been eating. The kids were asking where Nana was. He said I could fix this by calling off the lawyer, that we could work it out between us, like reasonable adults. I asked him to define reasonable. I asked whether reasonable was the word he would use for taking out a $65,000 loan against a property that had my name on the deed without telling me, without asking me, while simultaneously telling anyone who would listen that I was too involved in his household's affairs. Silence, long enough that I could hear him deciding how to play the next move. He chose pressure. He told me that if I forced the sale, the kids were going to lose their home, and that everyone, every friend, every family member would know that I had chosen money over my own grandchildren. I said, Derek, when you took out that second mortgage, did you think about what would happen to the children if you couldn't make the payments? When Claire spent the money I sent in April on your truck repairs and credit card debt instead of the mortgage, she told me it was for, did either of you think about the children then? He said that was different. They were drowning and they had done what they had to do. I said, you have been drowning for 14 years. I have been the oxygen. And instead of learning to breathe on your own, you just kept pulling in more air. He hung up. No goodbye. Just the dead click of a man who had discovered the account he had been quietly drawing from was no longer available and had no other play left in his book. I put the phone down. My chest was tight. I could feel the old version of myself moving around inside me, the one who would have called back, who would have found a way to smooth this over, who would have driven to Wexford Lane that night and pushed a check under the door with a note that said, I was sorry, even though she had nothing to apologize for. That woman was still in there. She hadn't gone anywhere. She was just no longer making the decisions. I went back to see Dr. Meeks, not because my scheduled appointment had arrived, but because I called her office and asked if she had anything earlier, and she did. I sat down in the angle chair and told her about the letter and the text messages and Derek's phone call. She listened the same way she always did, without performing a reaction. When I finished, she asked me something I hadn't expected. She said, you mentioned the envelope you wrote that night, your terms. She asked whether I had read it recently. I told her I had read it the night I almost called Claire and didn't. Dr. Meeks said, tell me about that night. I told her about sitting at the kitchen table at 11 in the evening with cold tea and my phone in my hand and the photo album open, scrolling through pictures of Oliver and Sophie, about how I had opened Claire's contact and felt the pull, enormous and familiar, to just end all of this by becoming the person everyone needed me to be again. Small, quiet, available, self-erasing. Dr. Meeks asked what had stopped me. I said 3 pages in a nightstand drawer. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you wrote the answer to that question before you knew the question was coming. That means it came from somewhere real in you, not from a crisis, not from me or from a lawyer, from you. I looked at her across the beige room. She said, that's not nothing, Margaret. That's actually everything. What I didn't tell Dr. Meeks, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was that the night before I had nearly called Claire was also the night I had started to understand something about the silence from Oliver and Sophie that was harder than anything I had dealt with so far. Claire had not allowed any contact, no calls, no visits, no FaceTime. I did not know if they were asking about me. I did not know what she had told them. I did not know whether in their understanding of the situation their grandmother had simply disappeared. That not knowing sat in my chest in a way that was entirely different from the legal battle, from the money, from the text messages. Those I could hold steady against. The thought of Oliver asking where Nana was and getting some version of the story that made me the villain that I could not hold steady against. That one found the seam. Victor filed a petition in December. 2 days later, I got a call from Sandra Holt, my late husband's sister, at 7 in the morning while I was brushing my teeth. She said Claire had called her the night before, hysterical. She said it sounded like I was trying to take Claire's house. I rinsed my mouth, looked at my own face in the bathroom mirror, and said, Sandra, do you know how much money I've given over the last 14 years? Sandra said that wasn't the point. The point was that Claire was her daughter. I said the point is $463,000 and a $65,000 mortgage taken against my property without my knowledge. That is the point, Sandra. That is the entire point. Silence. Then she said she was sure there was an explanation. I told her there was. The explanation was that my daughter and her husband had been taken from me for over a decade, and the moment I asked for accountability, I became the villain. Sandra said she just thought I should consider what this looked like. I asked her what it looked like when a daughter tells her mother she wishes she were dead. Sandra didn't have an answer for that. She said something about family and forgiveness and how nice it would be if everyone could just sit down together, and I said goodbye and hung up and stood in my bathroom with the toothbrush in my hand, thinking about how that's how the machinery works. The person who finally says enough gets cast as the aggressor. The people who spent years lying, manipulating, they become the victims, because stopping is louder than stealing, because a boundary looks like an attack to someone who has been living comfortably off your silence. Barbara Monroe's voicemail arrived 2 days later. I listened to it twice because I genuinely could not believe what I was hearing. Derek's mother calling from her condominium in Florida, informing me in a measured and deeply self-assured voice that what I was doing to her son and daughter-in-law was unconscionable. She said she had raised Derek to be a provider. She said he didn't need me hovering over his family with my ledger of complaints. She told me to call off the lawyer and be a mother, not an accountant. I stood in my kitchen and I thought about the card she had sent to the wedding I paid $23,000 for, $50, and wishing you love and happiness. That was the full extent of Barbara Monroe's investment in her son's marriage and household. $50 and a card. She had never contributed to a mortgage payment, a medical bill, a grocery run, a school supply, a single emergency of any kind. She had been watching me bankroll her son's family from her condo for 14 years and had never once picked up a phone to say I should be doing more. And now she was calling me not her son, not her daughter-in-law, to tell me to be more of a mother. I did not call her back. I called Victor instead. He said they're trying to control the narrative. That's standard. People who are cornered try to manage the story, but stories don't hold up in court. Documents do. And we have the documents. He was right. We had everything. 14 years of paper evidence organized and labeled sitting in a binder on Victor's conference table. Every receipt, every transfer confirmation, every canceled check. The title with my name on it in black ink. The second mortgage paperwork that no one had asked me to sign because no one had told me it existed. But the documents didn't stop the phone from ringing. They didn't stop me from lying awake at 3 in the morning, wondering if the people calling me were right. If drawing a line really did make me cruel. If the correct interpretation of this entire situation was that I was a woman who had chosen a legal dispute over her own grandchildren. I lay in bed staring at a water stain on the ceiling and thought about something Dot had said to me years ago back when we were still working the same floor at the hospital. We were in the break room at 2 in the morning with vending machine coffee, and she looked at me over her cup and said, "Maggie, you know what the hardest part of this job actually is? It's not the patients who die. It's learning that you cannot save everyone, and that sometimes the ones you can't save are the ones you love the most." I had thought she was talking about patients. December came fast and cold, and Victor filed the partition action, and somewhere across town, a family in a house I had helped buy received a summons, and I stood at my kitchen window and felt something I had not expected to feel. I was not afraid, not of losing Claire, not of being called selfish or heartless by people who had never asked for my side of the story, not of any of it, because the worst thing that could happen to me had already happened on my birthday in a sunroom I helped pay for. My daughter had looked at me and wished me gone. After that, everything else was just paperwork. Then 3 days before I was supposed to board a plane to Austria, standing in the canned soup aisle of a grocery store comparing prices on chicken noodle, my phone rang. Victor said, "Margaret, I have an update on the foreclosure timeline." I should also mention that I received a call this morning from the lender's attorney. The December mortgage payment was missed. That brings them to 3 months in arrears. The bank has formally initiated foreclosure proceedings. I put a can of soup back on the shelf. He said with both the partition action and the foreclosure now active, the house is almost certainly going to be sold. The only question is whether it goes through the bank at auction, which typically yields less, or whether we can arrange a supervised private sale that maximizes the return for everyone, including you. I asked, and my share. He said that after the primary mortgage and the second mortgage were satisfied, and after fees and taxes, I was looking at a recovery somewhere between $80,000 and $140,000. I stood in the soup aisle of a grocery store under fluorescent lights while a sale on cream of mushroom played out somewhere near my left elbow, and I thought about the $42,000 check and the $23,000 wedding and the $8,000 in April that went to a truck and a credit card, and the $65,000 loan that went somewhere I still didn't fully know, and the years before any of that, the ones that didn't have price tags, attached, the years made of double shifts and canceled vacations, and a phone that rang whenever someone else's life needed saving. Victor asked if I was still there. I said I was. I was in the soup aisle. He gave me a moment. Then he said, "Margaret, go to Austria. The legal process will continue without you. Nothing requires your physical presence until the January hearing. Go and clear your head, because when you come back, you're going to need to be ready to sit in a room and testify, and you're going to need every part of yourself to do it well." I left the grocery store without buying the soup, walked past the checkout lanes, past the self-service registers, out into the cold December parking lot, where a woman in a navy coat from a consignment shop stood beside a car she had paid for herself, and thought about a girl in Austria mountains. She had never seen a lake she had only seen in a poster. She got in the car. She drove home. She started packing. Hallstatt in winter looks like a place that has never heard of trouble. The lake sits between mountains, so old they have stopped caring about anything happening at their feet. The water in early morning is the color of dark jade, almost black before the sun clears the peaks, and the snow on the rooftops muffles the world down to something you can actually hear yourself think inside. The streets are narrow cobblestone, the buildings painted in colors that have no business being that cheerful in December, yellow and pink and white, and the air carries pine and wood smoke and cold so clean it feels like something you could save. I arrived on December 23rd with one suitcase and the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been holding herself together by sheer determination for 2 months and has just been given permission to stop. Helga, at the front desk of the small family hotel, handed me a room key and a ceramic cup of something hot that tasted like mulled cider, and she asked if I was traveling alone. I said yes. She said, "Good. Sometimes alone is the best company you can keep." She said it without pity, which was the most valuable thing anyone had said to me in weeks. My room was small and clean, a white quilt on a narrow bed, a wooden desk, a window that looked directly out over the lake. Nothing decorative, nothing trying to impress. Just a room that existed for the purpose of holding one person safely for a while, and that was exactly what I needed it to be. I sat on the edge of the bed and I cried, not the kind of crying I had been bracing myself against for 2 months, the kind that feels like drowning. This was different, quieter, the kind that comes when you have been clenched so tightly for so long that a single moment of warmth and silence is enough to release what you've been holding. I cried because the room was warm. I cried because no one was going to call at midnight. I cried because I was sitting in the Austrian Alps on December 23rd, completely alone, and for the first time in longer than I could measure, alone did not feel like punishment. The first 3 days I walked along the lake path in the mornings when the water was still dark and the mountains were just shapes in the gray, through the market streets in the afternoons where vendors sold carved wooden ornaments and warm pastries and candles. I ate when I was hungry. I slept when I was tired. I did not check Claire's social media. I did not compose letters I would never send. I did not rehearse arguments in the shower or run financial calculations while lying awake. I did something I had not done since before Claire was born. I existed without a specific purpose, without a task, without anyone needing anything from me, and I tried to locate myself inside that unfamiliar quiet. It was harder than I expected. When you have spent your entire adult life measuring your value by what you provide to other people, the absence of that providing feels like a kind of vertigo. I kept reaching for the phone. I kept starting sentences in my head that began with, "I should call," and "I need to check," and "what if they." The habits of decades do not dissolve in 72 hours. They recede slowly like a tide going out, and for the first few days, the water is still up around your ankles, and you can feel the pull of it. On the 4th day, I walked to a small cafe at the far end of the main street and ordered a coffee and a pastry I could not pronounce. The woman at the table beside me was roughly my age, white-haired with reading glasses on a chain and a crossword puzzle in a language I didn't speak. She looked up when I sat down and asked if I was American. I said yes and asked if it was that obvious. She smiled and said it was the shoes. "Practical," she said. "Comfortable. the shoes of someone who has spent a long time on her feet for other people's sake. Her name was Ingrid. She had been coming to Hallstatt for 11 years, always alone, always in December. Her husband had died 4 years ago, a mathematician who loved opera and was genuinely helpless in a kitchen, and she had decided after his death that she would spend 1 month every year somewhere that had nothing to do with her ordinary life, doing nothing useful, being no one's anything in particular. We talked for 2 hours, and not once did either of us discuss money or family or legal proceedings or the specific weight of being 67 and suddenly confronting the arithmetic of your own generosity. We talked about the lake. We talked about the pastry, which was too sweet but good. She told me about her husband's theory that you could predict a person's character by how they handled losing at chess. I told her about the strange intimacy of nursing, the way you could hold a stranger's hand in the dark at 3 in the morning while a machine counted out the remaining heartbeats, and drive home afterward and make breakfast as though it hadn't happened. It was the most ordinary conversation I'd had in months. No agenda, no subtext, no one positioning for advantage. Just 2 women at a table in a foreign country with 2 sweet pastry and strong coffee, and nothing required of either of them. I went back to that cafe every morning. Ingrid was there most days. We developed a comfortable rhythm talking when we felt like it, reading our separate books in silence when we didn't. One morning, about a week into my stay, she looked up from her crossword and studied me for a moment with the particular attention of someone who has been quietly observing and has finally decided to say what she's noticed. She said I looked lighter than I had when I arrived. I asked what she meant. She set down her pen. She demonstrated. She hunched her shoulders forward, curved inward, made herself small in her chair. Then she straightened, opened her posture, lifted her chin. She said, when you arrived, you sat like this. Now you sit like this. Something is leaving you, something heavy. I looked out the window at the lake, at the mountains standing patient and indifferent beyond it. I thought about what she was describing, and I knew she was right, but I hadn't had words for it until she offered the image. I told her I thought I had been carrying something for a very long time, and that I thought I had just set it down. She nodded, as though this was the most reasonable thing she had heard all week. She said, "Good. Don't pick it up again." Then she went back to her crossword. I sat there in that cafe with the cold lake visible through the window and felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for 34 years. Not peace exactly, more like the moment after a fever breaks, when your body stops fighting and simply rests. I was still here, despite everything, despite the birthday and the sentence and the 12 text messages and the phone calls from relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years but had very strong opinions about my choices, despite the legal battle and the months of silence from my grandchildren and the $65,000 betrayal and all the years of money that had disappeared into a life I wasn't considered a real part of. I was still here, drinking coffee in Austria, eating pastry that was too sweet, talking to a German woman about nothing in particular. That was survival, not the version I had imagined, not standing firm with your jaw set and your fists ready, just a woman in a cafe not needing to be anywhere else, not needing to be needed, just being. Victor called on the 30th of December. I was walking the lake path with my hands in the pockets of a dark green coat I had bought 2 days earlier at a shop in town because I had not packed warmly enough. I paid full price for the coat and felt no guilt about it, which was a small victory that I recognized as significant. My breath made clouds in the cold air. A small gray bird landed on a rock at the water's edge and looked at me with frank curiosity. Victor said the December mortgage payment had been missed, 3 months total now. The foreclosure was moving forward. He said the question was no longer whether the house would be sold, but how. A court-supervised private sale would return more to everyone than a bank auction. He said my recovery, after both mortgages and associated costs, was looking like somewhere between $80,000 and $140,000. I stopped walking. I looked at the lake, still and dark and enormous, and the mountains behind it, and the gray bird on the rock who had apparently decided I was not interesting enough to flee from. I asked Victor something I had never asked him before. I said, "Am I doing the right thing?" He was quiet for a moment. I could hear the quality of his consideration through the phone, the same steadiness that had made me trust him from the first call. He said he was my attorney, not my priest. But he told me this in 20 years of practice. Most of the clients who came to him after being taken advantage of by family had waited too long. Most of them lost everything. I had not waited too long. I had documentation. I had legal standing. I had the courage to use both. Whether that was right was a question above his pay grade. But it was not wrong. Not wrong. I had spent 67 years trying to be right. The right mother, the right nurse, the right person to call when the situation was desperate and someone needed saving. And all of it, the whole accumulated weight of being relentlessly right, had produced a one-bedroom apartment, a leaking faucet, and a daughter who wished me gone. Not wrong was a different kind of foundation, smaller, plainer, but real, something I could actually stand on. I finished my walk. I packed my suitcase. I bought one thing at the Christmas market. On my way out, a small carved wooden bird, painted blue, the first souvenir I had purchased for myself in more years than I could count. Helga hugged me at the door when I checked out, which surprised me, and held on for 3 full seconds and said, "Come back. The lake misses people like you." I flew home on January 2nd. The apartment was cold when I walked in. I turned the heat up. I unpacked. I set the blue bird on the windowsill where the light would reach it in the mornings. Then I opened my laptop and found the email from Victor with a subject line that made my hands go still on the keyboard. Hearing date moved up. January 19th. Prepare to testify. 17 days. I looked at the blue bird on the sill and I thought about Ingrid telling me not to pick it back up, and I thought about Hallstatt and the clean cold air that tasted like the absence of obligation, and I thought about the long conference room and the binder and the windowless walls and everything that was waiting for me on the other side of those 17 days. I closed the laptop. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and I started rehearsing. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old coffee and the particular anxiety of people waiting to find out how badly things would go. The hallway outside the courtroom was linoleum and fluorescent light, the walls that institutional off-white that communicates nothing except that someone made a decision a long time ago and nobody has revisited it since. Victor was already there when I arrived. Briefcase in hand, everything about him settled and prepared. He asked how I was. I said terrible. He said I was prepared, which he considered more useful than comfortable. The room was smaller than I had imagined. Not marble and polished wood, government-issued chairs, a judge's bench that had been refinished at least twice and needed it again, a water-stained ceiling tile in the corner that hung at a slight angle. This was the room where families came apart. It looked the part in the most ordinary way possible. I sat down beside Victor, and I looked across the room. Claire was there. She was thinner than the last time I had seen her. Her hair was down and unstyled in a way that was unusual for her, and she was wearing an oversized gray sweater I didn't recognize, the kind of garment you put on when you have stopped performing for anyone. She was not wearing makeup. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the table in front of her, and she looked exactly like what she was, a 34-year-old woman about to lose her home. Derek sat beside her in an ill-fitting suit jacket, too tight across the shoulders, arms crossed, jaw set, eyes fixed on the middle distance. Neil Barlow, their attorney, sat between them, looking like a man who already knew which way the wind was blowing. Claire looked up. For exactly one heartbeat, one breath, one instant that lasted no time at all, I saw her at 7 years old, gap-toothed and laughing, holding a dandelion in a backyard that no longer existed, cold feet pressed against my legs during a thunderstorm. She was in there somewhere behind the fear and the years. Then the moment passed, and the woman in the gray sweater looked away. Judge Raymond Whitfield entered the room, late 60s, reading glasses on a chain, the face of a man who had heard more than 10,000 stories of human failure and had developed the rare combination of having stopped being surprised and not having stopped caring. He sat down. He opened a file. He looked at both tables and began. Victor presented our case with the same quality I had come to associate with him entirely, not theatrical, not aggressive, simply relentless. He laid out the facts in order, the down payment and what it had cost me, my name on the deed, the pattern of financial transfers over 14 years, the second mortgage obtained without my knowledge or consent, the 3 months of missed payments and the foreclosure already in motion. He presented the documents, every receipt, every bank statement, every canceled check, 14 years of paper evidence organized chronologically. When he reached the second mortgage, Judge Whitfield stopped him and asked Barlow directly whether it was true that a $65,000 loan had been secured against the property without the knowledge or consent of a titled co-owner. Barlow stood and launched into his argument about parental gifts and family custom, about how parents routinely contribute to their children's home purchases without expecting legal ownership, about procedural inclusions and implied intent. Judge Whitfield listened. Then he looked at Barlow over his reading glasses and said, "Counselor, a name on a deed is not a procedural inclusion. It is a legal designation of ownership. If the respondents believed otherwise, they had 14 years to correct the title. They did not." Barlow sat down. Derek whispered something in his ear. Barlow shook his head. Then the judge did something I had not anticipated. He asked to hear from me directly. Victor touched my arm. I stood up. My legs were heavy in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. Every step toward speaking felt like wading against a current made of everything I had been told implicitly and explicitly about what good mothers were supposed to do and want and accept. Turn around, write the check, make it right, disappear quietly into the role. I did not turn around. I told the judge my name. I told him I was 67 years old and had spent 31 years as a nurse, mostly night shifts, mostly the shifts no one else wanted. I told him I had raised Claire alone after her father left when she was 3 years old, that I had never remarried, that I had put everything I had into her. I told him what everything amounted to, the number I had counted at my kitchen table on the morning after my birthday, and I watched him write it down. I told him about the April transfer and where the money had gone. I told him about the birthday visit and the sunroom and the silk robe and what Claire had said to me when she looked me in the eyes and told me her life would be easier if I disappeared. The courtroom was very quiet. I told him I was not asking the court to punish my daughter. I told him I was asking the court to acknowledge that I existed, not as a funding source, not as an emergency account, not as a name on a deed that no one had ever